Sounds like we have a helicopter coming through the room. Great. Well, this evening is by popular request, as it were, so you have nobody to blame but yourselves. You will remember that someone asked if we could touch on the question of women and dress and the women of Karbala, and we split it into three, and so I got into serious trouble when I talked about the rights of women in Islam. And this evening we're going to talk about modesty, the special character of a Muslim. And I've called it that because of a hadith of the Prophet. The Prophet said on one occasion that different religious communities have different characteristics. Now, you may find it hard to believe, but he said that the Christians were characterized by being full of compassion and soft-heartedness, because that was the nature of Jesus. And my community, he said, will be characterized by modesty. And so we begin this evening with a certain degree of tension, because everything that the Quran has to say about modesty is addressed to all humankind. So modesty is something that enhances human dignity, that enhances human nature, and therefore applies to all humankind, males, females, Muslims, or not. How then are we to understand modesty as the special character of my community? And I think the way I would understand it is to say that this is like a beacon community in the world, representing a particular emphasis on this character of modesty, which is applicable to all humankind. So the Muslim community are to be the beacons, as it were, to the rest of humanity. So I want to begin by tracing some of this through the Quranic verses. And if you want to find the references, I'm afraid you'll have to go to my website and you'll find a whole article about this that has all the references in it, but I'm not going to give you them tonight. That'll just be a test. We meet the word hijab in the Quran in several ways. First of all, we're told that there is a hijab between this world and the next. And then we're told that there is a hijab between heaven and hell that can never be crossed. And then we're told that there is a hijab between humankind and God, which will be lifted in paradise. We're told also that when God speaks with Moses, he speaks from behind a hijab. And finally, we're told that when Mary is pregnant, she goes off into seclusion behind a hijab. And so we get these 5 different references to hijab, meaning a barrier, a partition, something that secludes, something that curtains or separates. So therefore, I think of a hijab as being a bit like the door on the toilet cubicle. Nobody will think of going into the cubicle without closing the door. It separates, it's a barrier. Or when you go in to buy some item of clothing in the store and you want to try it on, you go into the changing cubicle and you draw the curtains. So drawing the curtains forms a barrier or a hijab. So this is our first model then of what hijab means. We meet it again in the Quran in a particular context. And the context is the marriage of the Prophet with Zainab. And the occasion of revelation goes something like this: that after the marriage had taken place, the Prophet invited some of the community to come back to his place and they were going to have some refreshments. But they overstayed their welcome. And so he decided he'd go off for a walk and maybe they'd take a hint. But when he came back, they were still there. And so he decided to go off and take another walk and maybe they'd take the hint. And when he came back, some of them were still there again. So then he got hold of a great big curtain, and we're told he drew a hijab and he said, that side is my intimate sphere with my wife. This side, that's where you guys can speak from. Now, from that model, then, I want to progress to say that if we look at human life, we can see human life is divided into 3 spheres. We have an intimate sphere, that's the matrimonial bedroom. We have a family sphere, that is, we're all family together, draw the curtains. And then we have a public sphere. And between each of these spheres, we can see that there is a hijab. And in each of these 3 different spheres, different codes of conduct apply. Different practices, different forms of dress, and different forms of speech. Some things you talk about in the intimacy of the matrimonial bedroom with your partner that you don't talk about with the rest of the family. Some things you do there, some ways of dress there. In the same way, this is family business. We don't talk about this on the street. Here we are, family together. I can wear my pink fluffy slippers, and that's perfectly okay. But I don't wear them out in public. So if we think then of these 3 spheres in which we have a different code of speech, of dress, and of conduct, then we're beginning to understand the way that modesty permeates our lives. When the Quran actually begins to talk about hijab in terms of human conduct, you will remember that the verse is addressed first of all to men. Therefore, anybody who thinks that modesty is a women's issue hasn't been reading their Quran. So it begins by addressing the men. And it says, "O all you believing men, lower your eyes, guard your modesty, for God knows best what is in your heart." And then it repeats the verse and it addresses all the believing women. Now, lower your eyes, guard your modesty, God knows best what is in your heart. The way that I begin to understand this is the eyes are the principal windows into the human heart. What goes in through the eyes enters into our hearts. Now, the advertisers know that perfectly well. As we go around, we are bombarded with images. If you go up and down the tube escalators, you will see they now have them moving so that you can't possibly miss them. All the billboards, all the images that we see are trying to influence and change our hearts. I must have it. I will not be a full human being without it, etc. So what goes in through the eyes affects the heart. Therefore, we're told, lower your gaze. Guard that which you look at. And this is then the principal foundation for human modesty. And God knows best what is in your heart. God knows the niyyah behind the act. Now you remember that there is a saying attributed to Imam Ali about the first look being what happens, but the second look is not to your benefit. In other words, we see things that we know are not necessarily going to improve our state of modesty just by being around in this world. But then we are to look away, we are to lower our gaze, because the second look is not to your benefit. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, if I'm talking about this to certain groups of young Muslim men, they will say, but I'm still on my first look. So God knows best what is in the human heart. Now, I would suggest that if the eyes are the windows into the heart, the tongue is the principal vehicle out of the heart. And so therefore, we get the scholars talking about hijab of the tongue, because it is the tongue that expresses the inner intention of the heart. And if there is not modesty of the tongue, there is no modesty. I have to tell you that if you walk through the middle of Birmingham at school and college changeover time, and you walk quietly behind some young men and young women who are dressed in hijab, and you listen to their speech, you don't necessarily get the personification of modesty. So it's really important then to think about the tongue expressing the inner quality of the heart. So modesty of the eyes, what's going in, modesty of the heart, what's coming out, of the tongue, what's coming out. It's rather more than that, actually, because the whole body expresses modesty. You think about the way that you sometimes see people walk as they come down the catwalk, sashaying along. It's supposed to evoke a certain sort of reaction. You see the person standing on the street corner on one hip.
That's just the man.
That's just a man. Who brought him? So the way that one walks, the way that one stands, one's bodily posture can actually often be the thing that breaches or incites a breach of modesty. It's an unfortunate reality that those of us who travel on public transport will know that quite often you're pushed up against other people in ways that you would rather not be. Certainly you get that on the buses sometimes, but during the years when I lived in London, you've got it on the tube nearly all the time. And because if you get on the tube, you know, they've got those curved roofs. So if you're my height, you're sort of like this. And there was one particularly hot summer when I can tell you that it became really problematic, because you dare not close your eyes, because you know what's going to happen next on the tube and where's the stop or so on. So I became somewhat of an expert on the mechanics of the front fastening bra. But without a nia, therefore, please note. So it's really quite a problem to preserve modesty in this society. What goes in and also what comes out. Once we move beyond the heart and the posture and the walk, we move into a discussion about clothes, because my clothes, our clothes, affect not only my modesty, but also your modesty. So I have a responsibility to help you to preserve your modesty. And therefore, the way that we dress affects both us and other people. Now, it's important to say that there is no such thing as Islamic clothing. How could there possibly be Islamic clothing? If you think about Eskimo Muslims and sub-Saharan Muslims, if they dressed the same way, both of them would be dead pretty quickly. What there are Islamic principles about clothing, and we get two. The first one says that the material from which our clothing should be made should not be see-through. Fairly obvious. And secondly, that it should not reveal the contours of the body. That's why we get people wearing abayas and such like, clothing that falls from the shoulders, because its design does not reveal the contours of the body. You see lots of Arab men, for example, lots of North Indian men wearing shalwar kameez, women too. So these are the two Islamic principles which govern the type of clothing that we wear. How do we make our clothing modest? So far, you will have noticed we have absolute unisex discussion. We haven't had any distinction here between men and women. Everything applies equally so far. Now we get the first slight change, and that is, how much do we need to cover up? Because the basic Islamic rule given to us by the scholars is that we should cover up. And covering up means at least a minimum. And so a minimum is given to us for men from the navel to the knees, and for the women it includes the top half as well. So sort of high necklines. After that, you start to get diversity. Now this is where the scholars get into their element, because they love diversity, because it means that they can go in their own direction. So up until now, we've got agreement. After that, you start to get some disagreement between different schools and different scholars about sleeve lengths and about hem lengths, trouser lengths, etc. And that's where disagreements start to come in. Now, it's not as simple as it sounds, because there is no Islamic prescription for having to dress in a dowdy way. Indeed, the Quran says that our clothes are an adornment for us. They are an adornment for us. Therefore, there is no prescription for having to dress in a dowdy way. At the same time, the Quran speaks of making ourselves beautiful for God. God is beauty. God loves beauty. We make ourselves beautiful for God. How might we make ourselves beautiful for God? Well, my understanding of that is that if you are coming to a packed meeting in the Jamaat Khana, you might think of having a shower, washing your hair, not eating garlic before, cleaning your teeth, putting on clean clothes, and then, I don't know whether it's a particular Whopper tradition or not, but in many mosques, when the ladies assemble in their quarters and the men assemble in their quarters, it's quite common that people will pass along a rollerball of perfume. You make yourself nice to be with, not offensive to be with. You make yourself beautiful for God and nice to be with for other people. So again, there is no prescription here that I've got to make myself look ugly. Far from it. God is beautiful and God loves the beautiful. There is, however, another dimension to this. There's another verse of the Quran, and this one is actually addressed to women, and it says, "Do not stamp your foot to draw attention to your hidden charms." Now, what on earth could that mean? Well, the scholars point to the fact that apparently in Jahiliyyah, in the time before the coming of the Quran in Arabic society, that ladies who were looking for gentlemen's attention used to wear a bracelet or an anklet around their ankle with little bells on it. And then you would stamp your foot in order to draw the gentleman's attention to come and see what was on offer. And so do not then seek to draw attention in this way. Now this gives us then another concept of being alluring, seeking to allure, to draw on, to lead on, we could say. So men and women should not be leading on in the way that they dress. This seems to be the tension then between, on the one hand, being beautiful, and on the other hand, alluring. And it's an interesting thought to try to distinguish between what is it to be beautiful and what is it to be attractive. Because beauty is a good quality. Beauty is a godly quality. Beauty is a quality that comes from the heart, from the spirit of the person. But how is that then different from being attractive? And somehow that's the sort of discussion we need to have, the sort of thought we need to have. What is the distinction there? There is then another verse which is addressed to women, which talks of covering up one's aura. And aura is one of those tricky little words that nobody agrees on its translation. It seems to be broadly translated as all one's attractive charms, all one's allurements, something along that way. Those things that are likely to excite other people's interest. And this is where the scholars then start to talk about covering the hair and headscarves. And then we get again another session of diversity. With the exception, to the best of my knowledge, of the followers of the Aga Khan, all other Muslim groups regard it as being necessary that women should cover their heads when they are at Salah. Anybody want to refine that position? I think that's the way it is if we look around all the various schools of Islam. After that, we have a whole variety of opinion. Some scholars will say that a woman's hair should be covered outside the house. My way of understanding this is that this is a passport. If you remain at home, you don't need your passport. If you go outside into the world, then there's your passport. So this is the way that they discuss this. And then they love to get into a discussion about square centimeters of skin. So then you get a conversation about the ears. Should the ears be covered? And then the neck, and then the chin. And then you get what I call the French nun look, this kind of wimple look, which comes around like so. And different scholars take different opinions here. So we've got a whole variety between, on the one hand, those who will say, cover your hair for prayer. After that, it's an option. To those who will say, everything except the porthole look. This bit here, as though you were looking through a porthole, is a requirement outside the home. Which scholar you want to follow is not for me to say. I think one or two other things to say about headscarves. A friend of mine in Leicester, a woman from a Deobandi school, who says herself that she was born in a headscarf, you know, and could not think of going out without it, has daughters growing up and decided that she'd better do some research into this so that she could work what she was going to say to her daughters. And so she set up 4 different groups of women as her research groups. One was a group that wear niqab, one was a group that wore a headscarf always, one was a group that wore a headscarf sometimes, and one was a group that wore a headscarf never. And then she went through a whole sort of research procedure, and the findings of her research were really quite interesting, because she found that actually a lot of women in Leicester, not in the Moharram community, in Birmingham, a lot of the women in Leicester were actually wearing headscarves for all the wrong reasons. They were wearing it as part of their identity. I want other people to know I'm a Muslim when I go out in the street. Well, is that what it's for? Or some people say, well, I'm wearing it so that other Muslims will recognize me on the tube or on the train and they'll give me a seat. What does that say about the men? That's all I can say. You've got to be wearing a headscarf before they realize they might like to give you a seat. Others talked about it as a kind of statement. A statement, I'm Muslim and I'm proud of it, as it were, in defiance of the wider society. You will notice, if you're observant like me, it's not unusual to find Muslim women going through society wearing a headscarf, but everything from the neck down doesn't speak of hijab. The rest of the clothing, what comes from the mouth, etc. So there are all sorts of things going on there. So I think we should be very slow to come to too many conclusions about the modern trend. One of the things, though, that she did find was that there was an increasing group of younger women who were deciding to wear a headscarf for all the right reasons, as it were, as a statement of their growing faith and piety, and that was a profound step that they were taking. It's also very interesting. I just want to share one anecdote with you, because I think this is a really complex question. After the attack on the Twin Towers, you will all remember that there was quite a bit of anti-Muslim hostility immediately that sprang up. And one of the ways in which it was seen was Muslim women wearing headscarves, having them pulled and jerked and pulled off and such like things. And so a couple of women, at least, put up a question to Zaki Badawi. Zaki Badawi of happy memory was the most knowledgeable, cultured, learned Sunni scholar in Britain, in my opinion. No longer with us, but he had a very deep understanding through 70 or more years of the study of Islam in a very profound way. And the question was, if I am wearing my headscarf in the street and it is provoking people to attack me or to pester me, what should I do? And Badawi's answer was to say, The purpose of wearing it is to send a message to say, I want to be respected. I want to be respected as a human being. I don't want to be an object of your lustful thoughts or of your interest in what I'm wearing. I want you to respect me as a human being. Now, if in fact, under these circumstances, it's provoking exactly the opposite impact, then if you think it's right, you're perfectly justified in taking it off and not wearing it in these circumstances. And indeed, I can remember having the same discussion in Paris just after the Charlie Hebdo affair, when these were very real questions. Now, again, fortunately, no imama, no beard. It's not for me to give rulings on these kind of things, but it's very interesting to think about them. Because if something is having an exactly contrary effect to that which we hope and we expect and we want it to have, one must wonder whether that's an appropriate thing to do in these particular circumstances. So I think that's a question for discussion. Finally, just a word about what I somewhat irreverently call the Ninja Turtle look. This is the niqab that just leaves you with a Ninja Turtle. Now, the vast majority of Muslim scholars do not at all think that that is even a desirable thing. There is a group of Muslim scholars who think that it is desirable, as it were, as a statement of one's piety. There are a small group, therefore, that regard it as something that is not wajib, but it is something recommended. The vast majority do not take that position. We have seen an increase in niqab wearing in recent years, as we're all aware. I think it shows the influence of certain scholars and certain schools. Now, there we are. That's my interpretation, that's my take, that's my analysis of what Islam is saying about modesty as an ennobling of human dignity, and therefore as the special character of Muslims. And there we're going to take a very short break while Akil does something with the machine. And then, inshallah, Imtiaz is going to invite you to join in the conversation. It's wet.
Would the ladies like to make their way forward, please? Or you can sit there. Okay, can I take a quick show of hands before who's got a question, please? 4, 5, 6. Okay, we've got 6 questions. 7 questions to get through.
It's going to be a long night.
So let's start with.
Just a quick one. Thinking about the fact that you said that modesty, so not having a veil in particular circumstances is a veil, and I'm trying to avail myself of the opportunity that I have in certain tabloids where I'm presented with an image, and it's the text that I'm more interested in. What's the ruling on that one? And I'm thinking particularly of the Sun.
He's talking about bare-breasted women's pictures in the Sun. I'll give you a fatwa on that one. You turn the page and don't buy it again. I think that's the simple answer. That we ought not to be in any way encouraging or promoting that kind of thing, I think. And certainly one of the ways we do that is by hitting them in their revenue and not buying it. And also setting an example of not looking at it, I think. There are all sorts of nasty pictures that appear in the newspapers that one actually wants to just turn over the page as soon as you click it open, I think. There's something in the Metro, there's normally a couple of pages there that are not to have sticky fingers on, I think.
Hi, Chris. It was a topic that was, I think, slightly mentioned yesterday in the Q&A about halal food. I only eat halal food, but a lot of people have a notion of, especially like when they go on holiday and we can't get halal food, it's like, okay, as long as you say Bismillah before you eat it, you're fine. And also there's the idea of now with a lot of sweets and things like that, that some of them have pork gelatin, some of them don't. Kids at school give the kids sweets. Are they allowed to eat them? How do we stop them? There's a lot of halalness around, and how do we encourage the children and how do we explain to them that there's certain things that you are supposed to eat, certain things you're not supposed to eat, and how they're supposed to understand it? Does that make sense?
I think let's take it in three steps. The first thing is about making meat that hasn't been killed in a halal way halal. And this was based on a fatwa given by Shaltut. Shaltut was the Sheikh al-Azhar in the first decade of the 20th century, basically. And Shaltut was asked the question whether or not you could do that. And his answer, being a smart Egyptian, as it were, was to say, is there any evidence that this meat has been offered to anything other than God? In other words, has any other name been invoked over it? So, you know, one could imagine a situation where an animal had been slaughtered in the name of an idol, for example. Anyway, Shaltut's argument was, in the absence of any evidence that it has been slaughtered in any other name, provided the animal itself is halal, you can recite Bismillah over it and eat it. This was a very helpful fatwa that was taken up especially by that first generation of English aristocratic converts to Islam, because they liked to go to dinner parties and eat what was whatever put in front of them, basically. And as long as it wasn't pork, they could say Bismillah over it. One of the Shia Marja has given a similar ruling, one of the Jafari fiqh. One can see the argument, whether one accepts it or not, I think is fairly dubious, to be honest, because halal is something a bit more than just that. Secondly, there are, as you know, little books. Well, they're not so little, they're sort of wheelbarrow-sized little books, which give you an analysis of E-numbers and all sorts of additives and such like. There's an absolute frenzy going on about these sort of additives to food. Now, my own personal opinion on that, frankly, is we should be worried about a whole lot more additives being put into food than just on the basis of whether or not it's halal, because there's an awful lot of garbage being put into food. I had a conversation with a man in Dublin who is responsible for providing halal meals for the airlines that turn around there. And he told me that they needed to put 72 different additives into a dish in order to keep it edible for long enough for it to be served, especially when some of them were being frozen. So you know that if you freeze it and reheat it and such like, it doesn't always taste in prime, pristine condition. But you want it to if you're going to serve it. So this question of additives, I think, is much wider than just, you know, seeking out certain E-number from a halal basis. I think that when it comes to training children, we don't want to make them totally paranoid on the one hand, nor do we want to give them a sense of blasé, anything goes. So I think that there may be certain things that we want to decide we should encourage them not to eat, and other things that we leave it up to God, knowing the purity of their intention. You know, with if there's a slight trace of gelatine that came from a sheep that wasn't slaughtered in a halal way, does this really breach our understanding of dietary law? Some would say yes, some would say no. Personally, I don't think that's the most important thing. I think actually we ought to be much more concerned about what our kids are eating in general than just those kind of issues. But I think it's that balance, you see. It's living in this society is not easy, and therefore we don't want to get paranoid on the one hand, but we don't want to get laissez-faire on the other. One of my Ghanaian Muslim friends tells me that he regularly entertains a Ghanaian Christian friend, and whenever he comes round and he says, "What would you like to drink?" he says, "Halal whiskey." It doesn't exist.
It's just follow up to the halal thing. I was observing some of the young people, and I've seen it when I was taking my children to the madrasa as well, that pig to eat is haram. We all know that as Muslims. But to watch a program where the pigs, it's a cartoon pig program, or to have a little picture of a dog on a rucksack and then take the rucksack to the mosque, etc., etc. I think, I don't know what your take is on that, but I personally think it's how can watching a pig is haram? And then one of the child says, Shaitan built the pig. And I said, if Shaitan made the pig, then he's equivalent to God, right? So, I mean, I think it's one extreme to the other. I just want to put it, what's your take on it? So just clear the head.
Well, I think I'm very much in your direction. God certainly made pigs. And there are good reasons to support the Quranic ban on eating pork. You know, all sorts of parasites live in the flesh of pigs. Pigs eat all sorts of garbage. Pigs are well known for rooting up dead bodies and eating them. not entirely attractive sort of food chain. You can't say that the shaitan made pigs because that's shirk. And so that's ultimately unacceptable. I can't see that it can do children any harm at all to see cartoons that have a pig in, or to have a little pink dog on their rucksack. You're not asking them to eat the rucksack or go and gobble up the screen. We simply need to teach them to live sensibly in this society. And if somebody else is eating pork, then they need to know that they shouldn't eat it, and that this is a divine command. I was doing a morning in Stanmore Madrasa about 3 weeks ago, and sharing the platform with me was a rabbi from the Board of Deputies, and he gave a good example there, I think, because he had two little girls who come along to share in the morning's entertainment. And he said, when I go shopping with my two little girls and they start plaguing me for chocolate, eventually I give in. When they plague me for bubble gum, I just say, it's not kosher, and they know not to ask anymore. So I think that there's a sense in which, we need to get a clear distinction in children's mind. There are some things that are forbidden. Don't bother asking. You can't have a bacon butty. Okay, we don't give in on that one. But the occasional square of chocolate, as long as I get two and you only have one, that's okay.
I want to go back to the theme of today on women's clothing, which wasn't the theme.
Thank you.
But I want to go to that topic. I've got into some pretty heated discussions even within our own community about this, because I feel that the wearing of the burqa is actually something that demeans women for the reason that the burqa has become associated with the Taliban's, Al-Qaeda, and those groupings who oppress women. They have shot a young girl who was going to school, who was promoting education for women. They have thought nothing about bombing schools and doing anything they can to keep women at home, even to throw stones at them when they're walking on the street without wearing burqa. So I feel that it has got to the stage where we women don't have a choice in rejecting burqa. I feel that we have to reject burqa in order to stand in solidarity with the women who are oppressed. So I feel more strongly than just saying, oh, you shouldn't wear it. I feel to say you mustn't wear it.
By burqa, I am meaning what I call a moving wigwam. Yeah? Something that comes from the head and falls in one piece to the floor and just has a grill or something here, like a gauze. First of all, there is no way that we can call this Islamic dress. It is the dress of the Pathan people. The Pathan people live in the Northwest Frontier Province and in Afghanistan. Go and see how many burqas you will find in Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country on earth. So there's no way that we can defend this particular garment as an Islamic garment. The question is it defensible as a cultural interpretation of Islamic dress? Well, it may have been in Afghanistan amongst the Pathan people. That's their culture. personally, I agree with your earlier statement that it is demeaning. I don't think that that's the way that human beings dress or need to dress, according to rules of modesty. I think that your idea that we should not, if I can be a woman for a moment, though you remember that one of the big BBC reporters managed to get into the Taliban ruled Afghanistan wearing a burqa, and it was fine until he started walking. And then they all said, wait a minute, women don't walk like that. Anyway, I very much hear and agree with your statement because of the associations with wearing the burqa in that particular context in Afghanistan. I would fully support any woman who said, I am definitely not going to choose that form, that style, that fashion of dress because of the associations with it. Just in the same way that somebody who said, you know, wearing animal furs is associated with rearing animals for slaughter, keeping them in unacceptable conditions, and so on, and therefore I'm not going to wear animal fur, would be a very powerful statement, I think. And so I would put it in that sort of way. I would certainly support somebody who made that decision, because I think that what is associated with it in recent decades with Afghanistan, with the Taliban, is a kind of oppression of women within that society that I would certainly, anyway, not want to support or encourage anybody else to support. And that would be a good token not to do it. That's my view.
Hi, Chris. I did have two questions, but I'm only allowed to ask one. And this one's not mine. It's just a discussion I had with somebody, so they asked me to ask the question. The question was based on Imam Ali as the fourth Khalifa. Okay? If the fourth Khalifa was a accepted Khalifa for all Muslims, then the practice of Imam Ali should be universal against all Muslims as the fourth Khalifa. And just a small example which we were debating was when we were praying hands down. So did Imam Ali practice hands down while praying? Just as an example.
Well, it certainly is the case that, as far as I'm aware, all major Sunni schools, all the four schools of Sunni Islam, regard Imam Ali as the legitimate fourth caliph, one of the rightly guided caliphs, and therefore of being in the highest position in that early generation after the Prophet himself. Whether he prayed with his hands down or folded, I'm quite sure that we could find a variety of scholarly opinion, frankly, because history is written from perspectives. So I'm sure that we would find Shia historians that were writing to say that he always prayed with his hands down. And I'm sure that we could find some Sunni historian who's probably writing the other way around. It's very important to remember that this is a diversity which is also fully legitimate within the Sunni schools. Malikis pray with their hands down. And if you go to, I can think immediately of a certain mosque in London in which most of the people who go there to pray are either Hanafis or Malak is, and it's not unusual to find somebody getting their arms slapped and saying, "Go, don't do that, you Shia, put your hands in front like me." So people don't know their tradition either. It certainly is the case that something that was reinforced from the Sunnah of the Prophet by the fourth Caliph should and would be regarded as being of great moment within the Sunni schools. However, the Sunni schools wouldn't really recognize the Sunnah of Ali, as it were. That the four rightly guided caliphs are reinforcing the Sunnah of the Prophet. So I don't think you would have as strong an argument as you would have within a Shia context, in which Imam Ali did it as the infallible, sinless Imam. That's all the proof you need.
Hi, Chris. I'll take you back to a question which asked about the legitimacy of beheading somebody.
Yeah.
Take the question a bit further. Basically, what I'm trying to understand is, even in the Old Testament, there is a lot of violence against other races. And how has Christianity, or for that matter Judaism, answered that question?
It certainly is the case that if you're doing a sort of violence and gory bits analysis, the Bible is much worse than the Quran. Everybody would agree on that, I think. In order to answer your question, one really has to divide between Orthodox Jews and in one group, and mainstream Christians and Reform Jews in the second group. Because Orthodox Jews believe that the first 5 books of the Torah, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, were given to Moses in a system of revelation very, very close, at least, to Tanzil. In other words, they are literally the word of God sent down, given to Moses, and therefore they have a status which is rather very similar to the Quran within the Islamic system. Now, what the Orthodox rabbis have done over the centuries, and they've been at it for a very long time, is that they have found ways of arguing that although it says that, you actually ought not to implement it. For example, there is a verse in the Torah that counsels the parents of disobedient sons. Now, any sons, close your ears, please. If a son is persistently disobedient, the Torah says, you are to take him to the village elders, who are to take him to the gate of the village and then stone him to death. Now, this may seem attractive on occasion, but it is not widely practiced amongst anybody, let alone Orthodox Jews. But that's what it says. And so they have, over the centuries, built up ways of interpreting that to say that would be an unacceptable thing to do. Now, the intricacies of the argument, I'm afraid, are beyond me, but certainly they've done it. As far as mainstream Christians and Reform Jews are concerned, the argument is a much different one, because they start from the premise that the books of the Bible are the divinely inspired works of human authors at a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain context. So that what was appropriate at that time, in that place, in that context, may not be appropriate at all today. And therefore, you would have no problem at all in finding Christian theologians and Reformed Jewish theologians who would say, in spite of what it says in the Bible, capital punishment is an inhuman, degrading act, and there are no circumstances under which we should inflict it on another human being, whether it's by beheading or any other method. You would certainly find them who would apply that same line of argument to various other verses, statements that are contained in the Bible. Women should keep silence in the assembly, St. Paul says at one stage. Or many mainstream Christian theologians would say that's because he was a misogynist. You know, that's because that was the context in which he came. He probably had a good beating off his wife that morning, and that was what he wrote. In other words, these are not divinely sent down texts. And that therefore makes a huge difference. Now, that then highlights for us the problem that Muslim scholars have with the Quran. There are those scholars who will regard it as being not only a timeless text, but a text which is to be interpreted without reference to the context in which it was revealed. And that gets you into all sorts of problems. There are others who say it must always be interpreted within the context in which it was revealed, and in the context of all the other verses of the Quran, and in the context of the overall arching premise of the Quran, and so on. And they then might well come forward with a position that says beheading people is an unacceptable practice in the modern time. So it depends who you ask and how they're formulating their argument as far as Islam is concerned, and the other two religions too. I would belong to that school that would say that all capital punishment is a degrading act. We should not inflict capital punishment on any human being. That's my own opinion.
Chris, my question for you is, what role do you feel music plays in Islam, if any?
Depends who you ask. If you go to the Sufi groups, they will say that music is an absolutely intrinsic part of the ascent of the soul in its embrace, in its quest of God. If you go to certain other groups, people will say there is no room for music at all within a Muslim way of life, even to the extent of putting the phone down if they put you on hold and it starts playing you a tune. Even to the extent of not going into a shopping mall if there's music being played. So people can take this, as it were, from one extreme to the other. I think the problem with music is that it operates on a non-intellectual dimension of the human being. It affects our emotions, it affects our spirits. Why do you listen to this music? It sends me, it lifts my spirits, it takes me out of myself. And therefore there's always the question amongst the scholars, well, if it's taking you out of yourself, where are you going to? And who's in charge when you get there? So there's always the potential then that music can lead people astray, let's say. On the other hand, it's also got to be the case that you say some types of music under certain conditions can actually then be beneficial for the human being. Because if they are affecting the emotions, if they're affecting the spirit, as it were, and they're calming you down, one of my Muslim colleagues tells me he always listens to certain pieces of classical music before he has to mark students' essays in order to tone down the comments that he writes. It has a good impact on my spirit. It settles me, it quietens me, it clears my thoughts so that I can. So you can see that music is an ambivalent thing. Now, there are all sorts of things happening in this, and I think quite interesting. You will know that if you listen to rap music coming from certain cultures, it's horrific. It's appalling stuff. Now then, we know that young people from various communities like to listen to rap music. It's one of the trends of the time. And so we've seen that there's been a Muslim rap group formed to say, let's give them the style of music they want to listen to, but with lyrics, with words that are ennobling of the human soul instead of utterly degrading. You can see the argument. You may or may not think it's a valid one. It's an awful lot better than some of the other stuff that people listen to. Part of it classically was always by association. You know, the old classical wine, women and song bit. It was what music was associated with, but often got it a bad name. Most Muslim scholars in Britain who've written about it don't seem to have a problem with certain types of music, the unaccompanied voice, the use of rhythm, for example, like the duff, this single-sided drum. Quite a few have gone on to talk about sort of classical instruments like the reed flute, the ney, and so on. So we're getting some more sort of seasoned discussion going on that way. It can be an issue with children as to what kind of music goes on in schools and to what extent children should be included or excluded from that. I think one really has to analyze the impact that this music is expected to have upon the human soul. For example, look what happens to Welsh rugby players when they play the Welsh national anthem before a rugby match. They all put on about 20 kilos and about 20 centimeters and act as though they ate concrete blocks for breakfast or something. It puts steel into their souls in a very particular way. Why do you have regimental marches in the army? Because it makes the soldiers identify with that which is beyond them, the regiment, and therefore they will do things that they wouldn't do if they were on an even keel. You're actually trying to affect their sensitivities. We know that that's been taken to a heightened level in some of modern military operations, in which you're actually feeding soldiers a particular type of music through their headphones, as it were to psych them up for what they're about to do. And you can see that's problematic, because I would say that's robbing people of their human dignity and ability to make a free decision. So you're coercing them, you're manipulating them in that way. I don't think that there's a simple answer to this question. Some quite interesting work has been done by the Association of Muslim Researchers some years ago now on different positions on music and music in education in Britain. I think that their report is probably still available, probably on the internet by now.
Yes. Got just to add to what Chris has said.
Oh.
Sorry, further question. Sorry about this. I didn't expect this topic to come up. Sheikh Ahmed Ali, when he was here, Sheikh Ahmed Ali, the one who actually taught Sayyidina Ahmad, he was his teacher, most learned Bukhari teacher. He said that music is not haram because they were actually being taught how to construct sitar as one of the subjects in the daras. On another occasion, I was talking in Canada to Hussein Hamdani, not the deceased Hamdani, but his grandson is called Hussein. And he sent me a cutting in which it said that the Prophet had solemnized a marriage. When the party went silent, he said, why, this is a celebration, why isn't there any music? And music was actually played in the mosque in his presence, and he liked it. This is their own record.
Just adds to the complexity of the question, doesn't it? Presumably good music is good, and bad music is bad.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and I think I know someone who wants to ask it. Adele? Yeah? Ready?
Chris, how do you know all these questions that we're giving you and to make us better Muslims?
How do I
Know these
know them? Well, how do I know the questions that are given? Well, I don't until people ask them. So and it comes as a big surprise when I get the question, you see. And then sometimes you may have noticed I have a little pause. And there are two things that are happening during this little pause. One is my little brain is going zzz, like that. And the other one is I'm making dua and saying, oh God, help me to answer this question.
I think Adele has a little correction as well to your question.
I think Adele has something he'd like to correct.
Yes.
After Lacante will do it for her.
Come on,
So
Auntie.
I'm gonna sort of say what Adele asked me, as might be an interesting question. He said, I would like to ask Mr. Chris, how does he know all these things to help us to become better Muslims?
How does he know all these things? Well, you see this grey hair I do? This goes grey when you spend a lot of time reading books and sitting with scholars and learning from them. And sometimes they're very kind enough to teach you things that you really need to learn and to teach you how to think for yourself to work out things that they don't get round to teaching you. See, if somebody just teaches you how to write with a blue pen, that's not so much good when you've only got a red one. So you have to learn how to write with a pen or a pencil or an ink pen or a big marker or chalk on the board. And so they teach me how to think, how to work out the question, and then hopefully to try and work out an answer. So I was very lucky to have good teachers, and I don't need much sleep, so I could also have lots of time reading books.
That good answer, Adele? Happy. All right, and I think we'll end on that note. So I'd just like to take this opportunity just to thank Chris once again. Thank you for all his time, all these great sessions that we've had, which have been very informative and something very different to what we've ever had during Moharram, and we hope to see you soon.
Inshallah.
There we go.